I'm told we're good to go. Let me just check. Can you hear me? Yeah, everybody can hear me? Fabulous, thank you. I do apologise for being a little late. I was doing some advocacy work for our subjects, which is so important, and it gives me great pleasure to be here now, even though running down that Vice-Chancellor's drive was a bit beyond me these days. You're a better sprinter than me. I know that he's a runner, and I'm not these days, so we'll see how that goes. So, good evening, and a really, really warm welcome to you all. My name's Sarah Barrow. I am Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and we're so proud to have that faculty here at UEA. Thank you all for joining us. Yay! I'm happy for all whoops in that direction. Thank you for joining us for our third inaugural lecture of the spring semester. It's really brilliant to be here this evening. I'm sure we've all had difficult times, difficult weeks, difficult days, but lovely times with our students who are now back here. And this is all about coming together for our disciplines, and our discipline of history in particular. Welcome to those of you joining us here in the Thomas Paine Study Centre, and also to those of you joining us via YouTube. I'm not sure where I should look at that point, but hello, it's great to see you. Thank you for taking part, and please, on YouTube, let us know where you're from. I'm sure there's many connections going on, and we'd be delighted. I suspect there will be many interesting connections going on this evening. Of course, my main job is to welcome our speaker for this evening, Professor Matthias Neumann. Matthias is Professor of Modern History and the head of UEA School of History. His first degree was in Modern History, Social and Economic History and Political Sciences at the University of Dresden, after which he came to UEA for a PhD, exploring the role of young people in the Russian Revolution. He's published widely on the history of youth, communism, and generations. For many years, Matthias has provided great service and transformative leadership for the development and promotion of Slavonic and East European studies at UEA, across the UK and beyond. He has been the organiser, tirelessly, probably tiredly, of the annual conference of the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies, BASES, I think it's, best called, for more than 10 years, growing into the biggest area studies conference in the field of Europe. And I've no doubt we've got many colleagues online joining us from across the world because of that. A warm welcome to you all. In 2019, he became president of BASES, together with UEA Professor Emeritus Peter Waldron. And in 2021, he was also elected to the executive of the International Council for Central and East European Studies. Amazing. Last year here at UEA, Matthias led the establishment of the new East Centre, an interdisciplinary research centre for the study of the former Soviet region. Had a really, obviously, important, monumental moment. Since last summer, he's also been the UEA academic lead for the university's twinning partnership with the Prekarpathian National University in Ukraine. And if any colleagues have been able to join us from Ukraine, we obviously wish you a hugely warm welcome as well. Matthias is an associate editor of History, the Journal of the Historical Association, as well as Critica Explorations in Russian and Eurasian History, which is one of the most renowned journals in the field. His current research examines exchange programs which enabled American children to visit the Soviet Union and the role of children in citizen diplomacy during the Cold War. And we've had a few chats about this. It's such an interesting area of work. I know we're going to hear more about that this evening. When he's not at work, Matthias is a passionate supporter of FC Energy Cottbus, the pride of, did I say that right?
Yeah.
More or less. The pride of his hometown, Cottbus, as well as of Norwich City. I was supposed to say East Anglia's only competent professional football club. But as a lifelong supporter of Ipswich Town, I'm not going to say that bit. So I would like to wish you all a very warm welcome again, And now please join me in welcoming Professor Matthias Neumann to give his inaugural lecture. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for these very kind words of introduction. It's really fantastic to see such a full lecture theatre. It's also daunting. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and also welcome to those who are watching it on YouTube. And I want to give a special shout out to my dear friends Sven and Antje, who are tuning in from Melbourne. We'll see whether they are the ones tuning in from furthest away, who had an early start. As many of you know, there have been happier times at UEA, as we are currently facing the threat of redundancies across the university. And they also look to fall disproportionately on the humanities. And today I'm standing here as the head of school of one of the finest history departments in the country. And I'm very much a product of the UEA School of History. The department has provided me with support, with mentorship, with opportunities, and intellectually vibrant environment to develop and pursue my research ever since I arrived for a PhD 20 years ago. So my achievements are also the school's achievements, the UEA Humanities achievements. And I'm very proud to be, and I feel very lucky to be a member of this amazing scholars, collective of scholars here at UEA. And there's a real threat that something that has been built over decades could be lost. So the humanities at UEA have been cementing UEA's international reputation. We must avoid this devastating start. It must not happen. And also after recent news, I'm wondering whether, I'm hoping not to be the first person to give an inaugural lecture as a kick-off of a 6 months farewell tour. So hopefully that won't happen. There are, of course, many individuals who played a big part of me to standing here at this moment. First and foremost, my family, of course, my wife Aurélie and the boys, Pierre and Matteo. And Pierre was really dreading this moment of having to sit through a whole lecture. So we'll see how that goes. They have put up with many long days, conference trips, research trips, and have always provided me with love and support. So thank you. Then there are, of course, my parents, who are here today as well as my brother and my sister and their families. And my parents have been my biggest backers, really, from day one, from the moment I decided that I wanted to study history. And they never questioned my choices. They always supported me when I decided to study for yet another degree in history. There are also many colleagues who have been very influential for my work, guided it, provided mentorship and support. I want to mention my former PhD supervisor, Edward Acton, who is here as well today. Welcome, Edward, who inspired me to study Soviet history when I came to UEA as an undergraduate Erasmus student for 1 year. And then there are my fellow East Center members, Kathy Carmichael, Richard Mills, Peter Waldron, and Francis King, and also the late Richard Desward, who have always given me invaluable advice on my research and support over many years. And the same also goes for colleagues from the study group on the Russian Revolution, as well as from BASIS, the British Association Slavonic in East European Study. And I want to particularly mention Judy Pallett, who I hope is tuning in from Helsinki. Judy is a really, truly inspirational scholar, and I'm really proud to call her my mentor and friend. And finally, I want to mention my PhD students, my former PhD students, who have always challenged and shaped my ideas and my approach to the discipline. I dedicated pretty much my full professional life as a historian to the history of childhood and youth. And the historical study of youth and childhood is not any longer a very young field, but particularly when we come to children and adolescents, one frequently still encounters the questions of why does it matter? Why do you study it? And I think there are some very straightforward, actually obvious answers to this. Children are part of the world we live in. You know, we have some here in the room, which is fantastic. They have a history, and one that goes beyond the perceptions of childhood held by the adults they became later on. Children, you know, can exercise agency, and I'm sure every parent in that theater today can attest to that, and sometimes too much agency. And when they exercise this agency, they can become historical actors. They can become forces for change, forces of socialization, rather than simply its passive objects. So children possess agency, historical agency, and there's some very prominent examples of that. If we think, for example, about Jeanne d'Arc, the peasant girl, you know, teenager who played a pivotal role in rescuing France from English conquest and changed France forever. Or more recently, we see these brave Iranian schoolgirls who have been standing up to the regime, showing incredible bravery. There's, of course, also the other side, the darker side. Particularly authoritarian regimes have always sought to mobilize the young, to socialize the young in a certain way, so they would support their ideological worldview. And we can see some truly disturbing examples of this right now again in Russia, where children are being mobilized, as you can see here on that image, in support of the so-called special operation, the war against Ukraine. The terms youth and childhood are often used interchangeably, though of course there are important differences. And I could spend the rest of the lecture just trying to define those terms, but I won't do that, which would be rather boring. But if you ask neuroscientists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, how they define childhood and its different phases, they would probably come up with quite different answers to that. Childhood in youth is, of course, also a social construct. So it will differ between different cultures and societies. The United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child defines child broadly in very legalistic terms as a human being below the age of 18. And for the purpose of this lecture today, I want to, I understand childhood as a specific period in the lifetime of people during which they develop their own identity and their individual personality. So adolescence, the transition from childhood to youth is in the very heart of this development. You may wonder how I ended up becoming so interested in that. And every historian will have their own story about their journey into their respective field. Mine is a very personal one, shaped by my own experience of childhood in the Eastern Bloc. And it started on a sunny day in 1984 when I received the blue scarf at a local army base of the young pioneers at a ceremony. And you can see a picture of me here, one of the very few pictures surviving where I wear that scarf. And that started, at that moment, I had a genuine sense of pride. I felt honored to become a young pioneer. That started my journey through, the state-sponsored youth system. And that journey itself was characterized by certain immature naivety, but also by real idealism, which, however, increasingly clashed with the views of my parents of the regime. They tried to, teach it at home in the private sphere. At the age of 11, age of 11, 12, I then became a child of the 1989 revolution that brought down the Berlin Wall. And my first memory of that year, 1989, is the one of the Tiananmen massacre, square massacre. And I still vividly remember watching the news, seeing how the state violently suppressed the students. Like most East Germans, our family was regularly consuming Western telly, so we watched it on Western telly. And I was really shocked, and I really started questioning the kind of righteousness of the state I was living in. And at school, I made a mistake exercising my agency to protest or to support, to defend the Chinese students whose actions were denounced by the East German government. And the teacher, that was in one of these regular classroom discussions of current events, and the teacher, of course, was in charge of reasserting the party line, reprimanded me in such a forceful, strong way that I ended up, for the rest of the class, crying behind the curtain by the classroom window. So that's my first memory of 1989. A few weeks later, we went on a holiday to Hungary with my parents, camping. Each morning, we could see empty tents on the campsite of people, abandoning. People abandoned those tents. They were escaping or fleeing the Eastern Bloc via the Hungarian border to Austria. And a few weeks later, in autumn, and then months in winter 1989, 1990, I participated with my parents in the Monday demonstrations in my hometown. And here you can see a picture of the very first demonstration that took place in my hometown, Cottbus, which was very late to the game of Monday demonstrations. They had already taken place in most bigger cities in East Germany. But I remember how so the artists from the theater, this is the theater in Cottbus, called for this demonstration. And there was still a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. People were unsure about how the police would react, whether the Stasi would intervene. And I remember my parents telling us, me and my brother, if they start arresting people, you will go to your grandma. They won't arrest children. But too many people turned up. The security forces didn't intervene, and it became an incredibly exhilarating and empowering experience, to be part of these demonstrations on that Monday, but then also throughout the winter. Still remember that power of the streets, the feeling of being part of a historical movement, witnessing demands, initially from radical reform. We are the people, to much more national demands of essentially revolution. We are one people, about German reunification. So looking back at this time, I can see myself going through this process. In spring 1989, I was still a fairly happy and stalwart pioneer of the Communist Youth Organization. In autumn, I was on the streets shouting, "We are the people," with my parents. In spring 1990, me and my brother were handing out leaflets and putting up posters for the so-called Allianz für Deutschland, which was a center-right coalition of parties that advocated reunification and went on to win the first elections to the Volkskammer, free election to the Volkskammer. And then in October 1990, we were celebrating unification. So these events really, and developments during 1989, 1990, they constituted a major step in my own coming of age, developing my own personal identity. And at the age of 12, I became really politicized. I became really interested in history. I can pretty much put it back to those events. And 20 years later, then I came full circle back to my youth in East Germany when I arrived for a PhD at the University of East Anglia, studying the first communist youth organization in the first communist country of the world, the Soviet Union. So this, in a nutshell, I admit a rather big one, is my own story into the field and why I ended up studying the Young Communist Youth League for the first 10 years of my professional life. I was really interested in how young people were experienced the revolution, how they lived it, how they shaped it. And of course, the Bolsheviks, they set out to create a completely new system. They wanted to create a new Soviet person. So children and young people were inevitably very central to this project. And the children and youth organization that they created was supposed to be institutions for political socialization, transmission belts really, but as I have shown in my work, the revolution also empowered young people because it assigned them an important role. And it was not always as easy as they thought to control the youth. And the Civil War played an important role also in that, became a real formative experience, the early 1920s, for those who fought in it. And I want to show you one photograph. You can see here of some young Civil War fighters. It's taken in 1921. They had emerged victorious. And I think one can really see vividly in that image how they parade their sense of authority and empowerment. I mean, try to send those guys back to school. I think that will be a struggle. We see youthful, indeed some childlike faces glaring into the camera and and asserting their power and authority through swords, rifles, and revolvers. And the victorious experience of the Civil War was a was where the key events for which these young people would understand the revolution and revolutionary transformation. And I don't want to dwell at all on my earlier work on the Communist Youth League, but I wanted to show you this picture because I was always fascinated by the very young faces in it. I was always drawn to that, and it attracted me later on to explore in my research the experiences of younger adolescents and even pre-puberty children as my research involved. And I had a small project where I was looking at children in the Russian Empire during World War I, but eventually moved into the post-war period with a fascination for transnational encounters of children via exchange programs and the role of children in the cultural Cold War. During the Cold War, as so often, children and young people served as a metaphor for social change. They were seen and also, crucially, also understood themselves as cultural ambassadors promoting social equality and peace. And states frequently appropriated, the visual and rhetorical discourse on children and young people to legitimize their respective worldviews. So we can see that in the Soviet Union as well as in the United States. Both states sought to mobilize the youth in the cultural Cold War. And there has been some absolutely brilliant work by historians on this, exploring this visual and rhetorical discourse on children in the propaganda war between the East and the West. But the one thing that I always found missing were the children themselves. Their experiences, their hopes, their dreams, their action. And this is really what I have been working on for the last 7 years or so. So in my research, I seek to enhance our understanding of peace as politics and citizen diplomacy in the late Cold War, shedding new light on the role of children as historical actors. And it reconstructs the experience of groups of American teenagers, I sometimes call them the Greta Thunbergs of their day, who dare to break through the Iron Curtain to visit the famous international session of the pioneer camp Artek in Crimea. And here's a picture of where it is located, and a picture of the camp. Each summer in that pioneer camp, which was a showcase pioneer camp of the Soviet Union, we have a really iconic socialist space. It encouraged thousands of children from across the globe to come together and engage in activities promoting transnational cooperation and Soviet-led world peace. And the trips to this camp, they were organized by the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship, which was an organization that emerged in the Second World War, when, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. And it sought to foster mutual understanding between the superpowers through cultural exchange programs. And this kind of organizations, this kind of friendship organizations, they emerged in most Western countries. They played a really important role also in Soviet cultural diplomacy. And between the late 70s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, this organization managed to send about 220 children to this camp, always each summer. And in the late 1980s, some other American organizations started to send children as well. And in my research, I try to, I'm examining how the encounters between participants, between Americans and Soviets, but also Americans and children from other parts of the world, shaped mutual perceptions of East and West, how their experiences were portrayed in the press in the United States as well as in the Soviet media, and how their actions fed, or what Paul depicted in a broader upsurge of citizen diplomacy that we see in the that we see in the 1980s, and the role this played in the ending of the Cold War. And I put the children themselves really in the center of my research. So I have, over the last 7 years or so, I've done more than 50 interviews with those American teenagers, Americans who went to this camp during the Cold War, with people who worked in the camp, delegation leaders, and other stakeholders. And through this also gained access to some really incredible personal documents, including diaries and logbooks and letters. This is one, if you're a historian of the history of childhood and youth, having documents written by young people at a time are always gold dust, because most of the sources we have are usually produced by adults about the children of their time. So one of these most fascinating documents that I managed to uncover was the diary by Valerie Ekberg from Anchorage, Alaska, who wrote a diary during her trip in 1979. And she amazingly was prepared to share with me after the third interview I did with her. So thank you, Valerie, again for that. I hope she might be tuning in today. In 15th of August 1979, she woke up in the pouring rain in the dormitory in that camp. And you can see Valerie here on that image. She's on the right there with the drawing with the chalk. The weather was really fitting her somber mood. It was departure day, and reflecting on this day of tears, she wrote into her diary, and I quote, "I truly feel that if every person in the world went to the camp just like Artek sometime in their life, there wouldn't be any more wars, and there would be peace, solidarity, and friendship worldwide. I love Artek and all the friends I made here, and it hurts so bad to have to leave." And a final diary entry here, which is in itself is a really powerful document of her own mental journey, engaging with, through this extraordinary world, highlighted that she had fully embraced the slogan of the camp, the leitmotif, which was peace and friendship. And for that young girl, she came from Alaska, so the Soviet Union was never geographically that far away. As for many of her peers, it was like a real bridge had been built across the Bering Straits. The Artek Pioneer Camp was really a truly magical place for children, and that comes constantly up when you do interviews and as well as in other documents. It's located in the beautiful area of the Crimean Peninsula, nestled on the banks of the Black Sea between high-rising cliffs, and it clearly mesmerized its young visitors. And I could see that myself firsthand when I accompanied a group of American teenagers, mostly of Russian heritage, in 2019 to attend the international session, which has been, which is running again after the annexation of Crimea by Russia. So that was 5 years after the annexation of Russia. It's huge investment going into that camp right now, certainly up to the war started, with creating new buildings, a new stadium, as it plays clearly a very important role in Moscow's propaganda campaign to reclaim Crimea and reintegrate it into the Russian motherland. But the interesting thing is that in the very heart of that camp, the ghost of Lenin is still there, or more specifically, the old Lenin statue, which you can see from almost everywhere in the camp, in the now cordoned off central square, I think serves as a vivid reminder of its socialist past. The camp itself has several sub-camps constituting its very own little world. As one former Arteker captured it to me, captured it in an interview, this kind of dreamlike nature of the environment. Tracy Broadhead from the Bay Area, from Oakland, she told me, "It almost felt like going into Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, walking into this world where there's color and vibrancy, uniforms and these beautiful flowers, trees and ocean, crushing waves on the shores. I was really happy." And Tracy came from a progressive family in the Bay Area. Her childhood was dominated by the civil rights movement in the 1970s and 80s. But it's not actually the case that all children who went on these delegations were coming from left-leaning progressive families. It's very clear that the early delegation, in the late 60s or so, they were all linked to children of communist activists. I mean, some of them called themselves to me in interviews red diaper babies. But it changed in the 1970s when Kathy Rothschild got involved. She was really a key protagonist in this incredible story. Kathy was working for a private school in New York City, and where she met on an event about youth hosteling the executive director of the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship, who was looking for someone to lead a delegation in 1972 to the camp. So Kathy wasn't in the Communist Party, and she went on this trip, which was a truly life-changing experience for her. After her return, her contract at the school was terminated, something that she directly attributed to her trip to the Soviet Union. And it's very clear from her FBI and CIA files that the trip to the Soviet Union put her on the radar of the federal agencies. Having lost her job, then she starts working for the council, kind of creating a new youth section. And a few months later, in 18th of December, a year later, in 18th December 1973, in an FBI file I found this. She was categorized as potentially dangerous because of background, emotional instability or activity in groups engaged in activities inimical to the United States. She described that trip in 1972 really as life-changing, an eye-opener, and in a letter to her parents, who were evidently disapproving of her, having lost her job starting for the council, she's trying to justify and explain her commitment to the program. She writes in that letter, "It is hard to believe what changes have taken place in me in the last year or so. This is all due to my job and travels. I truly feel that for the first time, my life has meaning. The only chance this world has is if the young people of two great nations get together in mutual respect and understanding. It's happening, and I'm part of it." And she then goes on to rationalize her work really in terms of promotion of world peace, struggling to comprehend why her parents reacted so negatively to her employment by the council. She says, "I've changed a lot of my ideas, but I'm a clear, rational, and free-thinking human being. I have not been brainwashed, only educated." And Kathy then really moans and criticizes that the program that was running by then, about 5 years or so, usually is only sending the kids of the activists, so the converted. If there's any point to a program promoting, challenging stereotypes, promoting mutual understanding, she said we need to set a broader representation of people. And in a report she wrote about this, she said include people from different geographic, social, political, and economic and ethnic backgrounds. And that was not just empty talk. We can see from the mid-1970s onwards that the composition of the delegations really changed. She makes connections with language teachers that promote the program, with other youth organizations such as the Boy Scouts or the Boys Clubs of America, the Girls Club of America, and also the American Indian movement. And as a result of this, we can really see a change, not only in terms of the ethnic background, which we can see a bit here in this picture of 1977, but also in terms of the socioeconomic and political backgrounds of the children's families. So it included usually quite a good number of inner city black youth from New York City and Chicago, but also Asian Americans, Native Americans, kids from middle-class families in Florida, and I have interviewed the offspring of military families based in Alaska. So quite a diverse range of people went on these trips in the end. Traveling to the Soviet Union was a big part of the overall experience. One of the early delegates, Rachel Lubell, who went in the late 60s, she recalled to me how they first flew to London, then took a ferry to Leningrad, then took a train to Moscow, and then from Moscow to Crimea. Travel arrangements, of course, improved over time, and usually they were flying from New York to Moscow, and then often also took a flight from Moscow to Simferopol, and then a bus to the camp. But in some years, the delegations also took a train from Moscow, sometimes together with other kids from other countries. And one of the delegates remembered as the longest train ride in history, non-stop partying, lots of singing, some teenage or underage drinking as well at times. And an interesting example of how a popular culture really shapes memories, which is of course something that we always deal with when we do oral history, is that 3 of my interviewees were drawing the comparison to the one, this journey was similar to the ones made by the young wizards to their renowned boarding school from the Harry Potter books. So that was the Soviet Hogwarts Express, if someone said. In the camp, these kids, so the delegations usually were about 12 children, 10 to 12. In 1977, they sent 32, so a really big group. They were matched with some Soviet kids, and then they lived together. They did all the activities together, lots of cultural activities, lots of sport, but some sightseeing. They also went to a collective farm one day, usually, and had to do some work, which was more or less popular depending on what they were doing, whether they were picking fruit or more hard labor. So although former employees of the camp, really stressed that they never treated the Americans differently from any of the other delegation, I think it's very clear for me that this delegation stood out. That's also how many of the members remembered it. Not only because of they were wearing their very own uniform, so usually blue jeans, which most of them sold by the end of the trip, and a T-shirt. But they were usually a small group, and they came from the United States, which made them stick out, as they would soon realize. The delegations from other Western countries, when it came from West Germany or France or so, were usually the offspring, were usually kids involved in socialist organizations. And that made them look very different. So, and sometimes they would express, they would encounter anti-American sentiments. So one of my Artekers, Ross Saunders, a boy from Alaska, recalled this conflicting reception to me in an interview. They were representatives of the class enemy. So he said, politically, we were the #1 enemy. We had the targets on our back. Everyone was like, they are the Americans, we hate them. However, culturally, he said, we were the cool kids on the block. Everyone wanted to hang out with us. Everyone wanted to be with us. So this Janus-faced attitude towards the US delegation then became also very pronounced in the more formal meetings that were part of the camp's schedule that took place every couple of days. So where the American delegation would meet with the Vietnamese delegation or with the South African delegation. So in particular, when some of these meetings when we have journalists present at these meetings, the fact that some of my interviews recalled that there were cameras in the room, that they were making pictures, and that these were reported on, highlights, of course, the political significance the Soviet authorities were assigning to it, as well as their propaganda value. Orson Watson, one of my US Artekers, who went in 1976, he recalled that the leitmotif of Artek, peace and friendship, was a very important factor in this highly politicized environment. He said, it was never framed in terms of capitalism versus communism. It was always framed in terms of peace versus war. And every rally we had was a peace rally. And these structured meetings, where the kids introduced themselves to each other, they talked about their country, their culture, and so on, they could be a very humbling, sometimes frustrating experience for the US children. They were confronted with, Soviet views of the West's colonial past, apartheid, liberation struggles. In the 1970s, the US delegation would usually, have meetings with the Vietnamese delegation, of course, with the South African, with the Chilean. So clearly, there was some design to it, which camp they were put in and which delegations they were meeting. And some of the children that I met, they were living in exile, had been directly affected by war, political violence, repression, directly or indirectly by US foreign policy. In the 1980s, the troubles in countries like Nicaragua were brought to the forefront. So lots of meetings with the Nicaraguan delegations. One of the US teenagers, Rasha Hamid, she wrote in her diary in 1988, and they were meeting the Nicaraguan delegation. She wrote, "Today we went to meet the Nicaraguans. We talked about peace. 2 kids are orphans. I will write their stories, so I won't forget." And then she goes on to describe, it's a really sad story about the 2 Nicaraguan orphans whose brothers and fathers were killed by right-wing militia groups. And once back in the United States, she then produces some really wonderful poems and essays reflecting upon her experience. So there's no question that these meetings could be challenging at times, sometimes frustrating, as I said. In the end, however, it's very clear to me from all my interviews and the records that I have that the vast majority of the American kids who went to that camp thoroughly enjoyed their experience there, and it became a formative experience for many of them. I mean, I showed you the picture of Valerie. She fell in love with Russia and the Russian language, and she became a Russian teacher. She's still a Russian teacher in Anchorage, Alaska. So for many children, coming together in this very peculiar world and being encouraged to think about and reflect upon global problems such as ongoing wars, political violence, and the tensions between the superpowers had a profound effect on them. Lindsay Rothschild, a member of the final delegation, stressed to me, she said, "The trip made you question everything you knew." And in a wider sense, we look at the 1980s, it was for these children, it was an important corrective, providing a counter-narrative to the very strong anti-Soviet discourse that existed in the early Reagan days in the United States. Meeting children, meeting Soviet children, learning about their hopes and their dreams, made them realize that Soviet people were, human, were very similar to them, and that they were often being demonized in the United States media. And Tracy Broadhead, who I showed you a picture of earlier on, she mentioned to me, she said, "I became much more compassionate because the Soviet Union became human, became people. It wasn't just the enemy." And these reflections are also corroborated by questionnaires that some of these kids completed afterwards and reflective essays they wrote. So a significant number really of them, they really embraced the notion of Artek, peace and friendship. And reflecting on her experience on her return in 1977, one of the kids wrote, "Yes, the festival influenced me a great deal, but when I tell my pa, he will say my ideas are all hogwash. But still, I learned a lot on politics and how the kids are doing under each separate power. I think America, being a strong and influential nation, should rise up and express peace and solidarity. I was brought up by my pa's opinion, and he was a staunch Republican. Now I have an open mind to the problems of the world." And it was particularly this internationalist setup, so not even just living with the Soviets, but there were kids from all over the world that being able to live and engage with kids from across the globe, that really seemed to have touched the hearts of the young visitors and created this transformative experience. Jo Saunders, a teacher from Anchorage, who promoted always the problem to her kids at school, not least because there was an opportunity to have a proper summer. She stressed that point to me. She said, "I remember one of my students saying, when he got back, there were students from 132 countries there. When I left, I didn't even know there were 132 countries in the world. And so the idea of internationalism really struck my student." So it's clear to me that becoming citizen of the world in this, in the camp's microcosm, encouraged really those young American teenagers to start thinking more critically of their own country as well. And you may ask, why does this all matter? That's a kind of little micro-history of a few teenagers that went to the Soviet Union. One of the central aims of the National Council of American Soviet Friendship, of this organization, was to disseminate this experience, when these kids would come back, to share their experience and to challenge the Cold War discourse back in the United States. This is, of course, one area where Soviet cultural diplomacy, so state-sponsored, organized cultural diplomacy, and the objectives of the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship naturally aligned. But in the late 60s and also for most of the 70s, the dissemination of this experience, I think, was really limited to the orbit of this organization, the local chapters of the national councils, and the rare newspaper article. But we can see a clear sea change for children diplomacy and its media representation in the early 1980s, which you remember saw initially a marked deterioration, of course, in the relationship between the two superpowers. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we have the arrival of Reagan in the White House, really increased fears about nuclear war. And this in turn spurred the revival of the anti-nuclear and peace movement in the 1980s. And children from both sides of the divide, they started also to express their fears about nuclear war, in essays or so they wrote in school, but also in writing letters to political leaders, which was a Cold War, genre really. Most famously, this girl, Samantha Smith, 10 years old, from Manchester in Maine, who wrote a letter to Andropov in November 1982, which was published in Pravda in 1983, and she was invited to the Soviet Union, went with her family, and also visited the camp Artek, which became an absolutely crucial part of this trip. But that trip really captured worldwide media attention, and it signaled, and her conduct and the way she behaved and the things she did after signaled an important challenge to Reagan's evil empire rhetoric. She created a space for a growing number of people on both sides of the divide to contest the image of the other, the one of the enemy. At a very time when we look at the political discourse, it really pointed to war. And it's clear that after 1983, because of this high-profile case, the Artek program that I'm studying also received increasing exposure in the US media. We usually have lots of articles in local newspaper. You can see here one about Heather Moore, who in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. We have them being interviewed by local and regional radio channels. Heather Moore here, she had her Artek experience positively portrayed. She was quoted saying, "There was little talk of politics and no propagandizing on behalf of communism," and she described the camp as a place to tear down the animosity between the two countries. It is, of course, very difficult, to separate the action of these teenagers from the adults that surround them, from the people who organized these trips, from their parents, from the delegation leaders, and from the journalists who wrote their stories. But I really think that it would be wrong to discount the youngsters' agency in the process of reflecting on their experience, deciding whether and what way to share it, and how to act up on it once they came, settled back into their normal life in their communities. So the success of this program that I'm studying, could be seen as being, limited really in terms of challenging Cold War perception and stereotypes, could be seen limited to these children. But the broader significance actually becomes evident when examined as part of a much broader upsurge of citizen diplomacy in the late 1980s, which really saw a dramatic expansion of cultural and educational exchange program. And these programs not only enabled really hundreds of thousands of transnational encounters between American and Soviet citizens, but the development was also accompanied by strong discourse demanding world peace to preserve the future for all children. So children are, again, an important imagery here. Children were frequently held up as a special group of people, innocent and pure, with the ability to bridge the ideological divide. And the musical Peace Child, which I'm not sure whether, played also an essential role in this process, in cementing the image of children as harbingers of peace between the superpowers. It became a very popular musical in the 1980s, and here you can see a picture of it being performed as part of a TV program. There was a satellite link between Minneapolis and Moscow, watched by millions on both sides, or in the Soviet Union as well as in the United States. And you can see a picture of Samantha Smith at the back, because it was dedicated to her, because she had just died in a plane crash a few weeks earlier. There were other organizations, such as one called Perhaps Kids Meeting Kids Can Make a Difference, that facilitated thousands of pen friendships between American and Soviet children. So children, is very evident, became important symbols in the discourse on Cold War detente in the 1980s. And these debates were naturally dominated by adults. But they also open up avenues for more children to act out their developing political agency. And with all things political, there's of course a broad spectrum of becoming engaged and active, from writing letters to politicians, to engaging in transnational pen friendships, to applying for an exchange program, or being part of a musical as Peace Child that promoted the idea of children collaborating across the divide and promoting peace. You can see here a picture of one of my interviewees, Barry Pisano, a Native American. And this is usually a common thing when I interview these people. They come, they have piles of letters from people. You can see he received a letter from Natasha in Moscow. Must have been around Christmas time, given the imagery. So through these activities, the letter writing and so on, they not only helped to reinforce the image of children as heralds of peace, but also became active players in a growing movement of citizen diplomacy that really shaped the late politics, that shaped the global politics of the late Cold War. To conclude then, the real impact of that program that I'm studying, and the hundreds of thousands of American-Soviet encounters in the 1980s, I think occurred really in the regional and local media, because regional and local media acted really as an amplifier. Community and locality played a big part of that. And the trips to the Soviet Union were captured before they left, and then again once they returned. They were usually portrayed, these trips, as an extraordinary adventure of a fellow community member. The local and journalists had very little incentive to portray these things in overtly political ways. Quite on the contrary, we can always see quite a sense of community pride, that one of their own had become a cultural ambassador, a citizen diplomat representing the United States. So they focus on the personal experience and essentially turn it into a human interest story with an emphasis on peace and friendship and an end to enmity. And in doing so, they help to depoliticize the existence and rapid growth of reciprocal transnational encounters, and also gradually changed the strong demonization of the other. And there were clear synergies in the late 1980s between the growing momentum of citizen diplomacy, the regional local media discourse, and changing public opinion in the United States. There was about the threat the Soviet Union would pose to the United States. So little by little we see it started a process that incentivized also policymakers, nudging and pushing others, dragging others into a direction that created a political space for engagement also at the highest level between Gorbachev and Reagan. It helped to build the pathway for Reagan and Gorbachev to talk to each other, to negotiate, and to face off Cold War warriors that they all had in their own ranks. And some children, that's my argument, and here we have them again with their Soviet peers, played a part in this development that helped to pave a way to end the Cold War. I believe they were making history. Thank you.
First of all, I'd just like to thank you so much for a great inaugural of great humanity. Thank you so much. Would anybody like to start in the room? I'm not actually quite sure how we get the questions online, but I'm sure, I'll be told, that's great. But does anybody have a question or a comment? Yes, please. Would you like to bring a microphone? That would be wonderful. Just so that our lovely visitors online can hear you as well. I'm sure they're far and wide. They'd love to hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. That was great. I study missionary interactions with children. I'm a PhD student here. So with looking at that stuff, a lot of what we see in the visual images is proselytizing and, convincing children to become Christians all over the world. And I'm wondering, in terms of, you've mentioned Soviet propaganda, but I'm wondering, was there any overt proselytizing to the international children that came? Were they being in any way open about trying to convince them that the Soviet way of life was, or was that too in their face?
Absolutely, of course. I mean, the whole program, we know from the official documents in terms about how the camp was run and so on, that the Soviet authorities, they thought that as a result of a 2 to 3 week stay in that camp, the children, from wherever they were coming, should develop a positive view of Soviet life. They should understand the correctness of Soviet foreign policy. So clearly this was a big thing. Whether they were successful in that, I'm not so sure. I mean, to a certain level, absolutely, But I think this is it's a controlled environment. It's designed by adults. They put several thousands of kids in there. It's a very regimented schedule of what they do, I always look at it as Artek exists as a political space, where children are exposed or clearly to Soviet ideas about world, about conflicts in the world, but then Artek also exists as a social space, in between all these scheduled activities. This is where the real things happened, when these children were just getting together, hanging out. As I mentioned, the Americans were always, in a way, very popular because, they were cultural icons. And, they're bringing, their music. They were always bombarded with requests, for their blue jeans. But absolutely. I mean, this is a political space, and as I showed the pictures of, Artek right now, after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and clearly, once again, it is this. Because when you look at the international session now, I attended, and when you look at the tweet by Russia's MFA in Crimea, they say here 3,470 children from 76 countries in 79 regions in Russia. What the reality behind this was that 98% or so of all these children are of Russian heritage. Russian was the only language in the camp. In fact, only one of the kids from the American delegation needed a visa. They all had a Russian passport. And that was the offspring of one of the people who went in during the Cold War. So rather than, in the Soviet times, it was about reaching out. It was generally reaching out to the world, bringing the world to the Soviet Union, and showcasing the system. And ideally, they would leave with a sympathetic view of the Soviet Union and so on. Now it seems to be, as a tool for Russia to connect with their diaspora, and foster these links to support, of course, Russian foreign policy. So quite different. But absolutely, I take the point. It is a highly politicized environment. And there were clear, the intention was to convince those children of, that Soviet life was good and the correctness of Soviet foreign policy.
Great question. Thank you. Great answer, I reckon, too. Do we have time for a couple more questions? Yeah? Brilliant. Georgia, please come forward.
Hi. Really fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I was just wondering a little bit. So you talked a lot about the kind of socialising that takes place in Artek, and I was wondering about language use. So I'm presuming the American delegations wouldn't have had much Russian. What was it? How did it work in terms of translation, or was English kind of the lingua franca?
No.
How do they talk to each other?
Very few of the Americans who went had any Russian language skills. They were all usually meeting up in upstate New York a week before they went, and they learned the Russian alphabet, but that was pretty much it. But from the moment they arrived in the Soviet Union, they were having some Soviet chaperones, translators, that were with them most of the time. So certainly when I had these formal meetings, it was usually the use of an interpreter. But apart from that, some of the Soviet kids could speak a little bit of English, and then it was just non-verbal communication, a lot of that as well, that they really stressed to me. On the other hand, the Americans were usually also drawn to delegations from countries that spoke English. So for example, the South African delegation, there were always close links when they were based in the same subcamp. But they had interpreters and a lot of non-verbal communication as well. But this is the problem when I went in 2019, and there was this one American girl who had no Russian heritage, no Russian language, and arrived in this camp, and supposedly 3,500 children from 76 countries, and there were no interpreters. So she didn't have a great time. Certainly not initially. There were lots of problems because everyone else was speaking Russian, and she was really feeling quite excluded.
Thank you so much. Do we have maybe one or two more questions? Yeah, we've got one there, yeah? And then we have one from Francis, thank you. Becky, thank you.
Hi, that was great, Matthias, thank you. Slightly flippant thing going on from your non-verbal communication. I was wondering about romance. But more seriously, I was connecting this back to that first picture you showed of the Bolsheviks fighters, and you didn't use the word child soldiers, but now that's the language we would use. And of course, when we're thinking about, much of this lecture has been the more celebratory aspects of child agency. But I'm just wondering whether you can kind of, reflect on the need perhaps in, historians of sort of youth and childhood to find that balance between the, I don't know, sort of the victim or the innocent kind of thing, and accepting children are fully human like adults, shock, horror, and just something about that really. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I mean, very, very good point, Becky. No, you're absolutely right. I guess with my research, I want to really force a little bit going into the other side, because children are often only seen and perceived as, passive and, without agency and a victim, and, they can be brainwashed very easily and so on. But you're absolutely right. I mean, these were child soldiers, many of them. This is a huge camp, with thousands of children in there. And as with all institutions that have, as we know from history, have hundreds of children and adults together, there are instances where children become victims. There are cases that I've encountered, reported in my interviews about rape, and in that camp, it's huge. You have Dutchess by the Communist Youth League, so you have middle-aged men, 25 to 40, often present at the same time as you have 3,500 children. So there are this, that's something that I've encountered. I haven't been able to, look into any detail. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the two sides, and that's why I showed the picture of children being clearly targeted. When we look at authoritarian regimes, they try to mobilize children. They try to bring them up, in a certain way, with a certain worldview, produce loyal supporters. What I think is very clear from my research also on youth, when we look at the slightly older people, is that they struggle to do so effectively at a certain point. And that, the agency of young people, the fact that they want to question things, they want to challenge authority, is often winning out and providing, problems to the adults that seem to design these instruments for, political socialization and try to, assert conformity through them. I'm not sure whether this really answered your question, but...
It's good. Yeah. We've got time for one more question. I think Francis would like to ask it. If you could just hold on 2 secs while we get the microphone to you, Francis, so that everybody out there, all our friends, can hear us. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. Very interesting indeed. This actually follows on from the your final remarks in your last answer, because I was wondering about how you saw the differences between Soviet children's work, international children's work, children diplomacy, and Soviet youth work, of which I have a certain experience. But it seems to me to be very different from the way in which they handled children. I think it was probably a much larger enterprise, youth work, and I get the impression from your answer that it probably wasn't anywhere near as successful in creating the kind of impression they wanted. But I wonder what you thought about this.
So just to clarify, so you're talking about...
There's work with children, and there's work with youth, often through the World Federation of Democratic Youth, the youth festivals and all that sort of thing, which I think was a much larger enterprise for the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
With a rather more refractory kind of audience. I just wonder how you assess these
Basically
successes.
giving you a bigger project now, isn't it?
Well, one of the things, when we think about Soviet, culture diplomacy and these exchange programs, they all really opened up after Stalin's death. I mean, we look at the late Stalin years, the visitors to the Soviet Union were in this, were a few hundreds a year. It became thousands and thousands in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, not least because they wanted to make money from tourism. But on the one hand, you can invite the world to you, and you want to showcase your experiment, but it's a double-edged sword, because you also you'd always try to control this, but you allow young Soviets to come together with their Western counterparts, and they will encounter other ideas and other cultures and things. So. And that certainly is something that also happened in that camp. It goes in both directions, I think. But we see that with the youth festival. In youth festivals in the Soviet Union, particularly the one in 1957, which was the first big one, where several thousands youngsters from all over the world came to Moscow, and by and large left, we know that from research, with a very positive experience. It was all a quite fun affair. But the Soviet youngsters were even more impressed by their Western counterparts and their culture and the stuff that they could do and were allowed to do and the stuff that they're engaged in. So, and as far as here really in that project, I'm looking at this younger, not youth as such. In my previous project on the Communist Youth League, When we look at the differentiation between childhood and youth in the Soviet Union, the youth organization, the system they created effectively defined it, because you had the young communists usually for age 14 to 25, and then you had the pioneers below that. In that camp, usually the kids are between 12, 13 and 17, so that's the age group I'm looking at.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Thank you so much for a fabulous event, everybody here, to celebrate your work, your inaugural lecture as Professor of History, of Modern History here at UEA, which is so important. Thank you, colleagues, for being here, for being present, for being celebratory for what's so important for Matthias, our colleague. These things are so important for arts and humanities here at UEA, and we're so pleased to have such a great crowd in the evening. And also, I think, online, which is wonderful. Thank you for everybody who's joined us far and wide. We do, I think, have a little drink, a little refreshment to share with you afterwards. But before that, I would just like to ask everybody to join me in thanking Matthias and congratulating him so massively for this amazing achievement as Professor of Modern History here at UEA. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.